On March 15, 2011, the Arab Spring protest movement reached Syria. Crowds of people rejected the personalist dictatorship run by Bashar al-Assad. Assad also served as the commander-in-chief of the Syrian Armed Forces. On April 25th, he used his power to command 6,000 soldiers to slaughter hundreds of Syrian protesters in the city of Daraa. The explosive civil war in Syria has roots tracing back half a century to when the Assad regime first secured power after a chain of coups crippled the government. Over the course of the conflict, the Syrian population was splintered into 6 major factions, with hundreds of smaller groups, while 10 more external countries or militant groups also intervened in the ongoing conflict. Today, we'll learn how Assad rose to power, what happened during the early stages of the Syrian civil war, and the ongoing effects of the crisis in Syria. From ancient civilization to dictatorship. Syria has a rich history dating back over 10,000 years to the Neolithic Age. Archaeologists have discovered that Syria is one of the oldest civilizations in human history, as the Mesopotamian culture expanded to the northwest and people settled in the region. Settlers eventually grew into the kingdom of Ebla, which later fell to the Akkadian Empire. Syria is also home to the 4th oldest capital city in the world, Damascus. For hundreds, if not thousands of years, Damascus was the center of Arabic arts like poetry and music. For a time, Syria was a major exporter of petroleum, oils, and crude material. But the exports have all but dried up, and the holy city of Damascus has been all but snuffed out by censorship. Modern-day Syria got its roots when Britain established the nation after World War I as part of the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France, which outlined the spheres of influence between the two countries following the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. But everything started to change for Syria in 1954. Prior to 1954, the country was locked into a military government by Adib al-Shishakli. But that year, al-Shishakli was overthrown. Democracy was restored. Peace wouldn't last long, however. In the newly reformed democracy, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party became the second largest political party in the Syrian parliament. The Ba'ath Party advocated for unionization, land reform, and rejected traditional caste social structures where different economic classes are segregated. The ideas of the Ba'ath Party helped win support from the educated population of Syria, who were disillusioned by the role of foreign powers in the Syrian government. Word eventually spread that the new Syrian democracy was mostly a front for France's colonial arm, and on March 8, 1963, the Ba'ath Party's military committee of the Syrian regional branch rejected the democratic system established by foreign powers and took control of the government in an event dubbed the Syrian coup d'etat, or the 8 March Revolution. The new government purged rivals, and other groups retaliated by staging more coups. Eventually, in 1971, the dust settled and Hafez al-Assad rose to power as the new president. He pushed capitalist ideologies, which won him favor with citizens and politicians who opposed the Syrian regional branch, still the de facto party of Syria. Shortly after Hafez al-Assad took office, he began making steps towards securing his power by dictatorship. He switched from his stance on capitalism and sided with the communist countries during the Cold War, and the history of dictators within the Soviet Union no doubt provided Assad with a plan to exert more control and retain his power. In 1973, he created a new constitution removing the rule stating that all Syrian presidents must be Muslim. In response, the Muslim Brotherhood staged armed assaults on Hafez Assad's government, but they weathered the storm. Bashar al-Assad and the Arab Spring. While Hafez was creating the framework that his son would later inherit, Bashar al-Assad was training in London to become an ophthalmologist. That was until his older brother Bashar died in a car crash in 1994. Then, for the next 4 years, Bashar was trained to take over Syria when the time came. Once he took office, Assad began spouting paranoid claims that anyone who opposed his government was an agent of foreign powers. He restricted human rights, including the right to assembly and the right to freedom of expression. Public gatherings were limited to 5 people or less for decades, and while Assad continued to suppress the Syrian people, other geopolitical factors began to reach boiling point. Youth unemployment rates were steadily rising, and a record-setting drought gripped the country for 5 years, from 2006 to 2011, reducing agricultural output. Fewer crops spiraled into higher food prices. Farmers were forcibly displaced to cities just to survive. The Syrian people started to fight back on March 15, 2011, when massive protests gridlocked the streets of Damascus and Aleppo in response to the arrest of a boy. The boy, named Omar, had written a graffiti tag that said, "It's your turn, doctor," which was a slight directed at Assad's college education. These protests would later be classified as part of the Arab Spring, a chain reaction of protests that spread across 14 different countries over the course of 2 years. Arab Spring was a massive movement where much of the Arabic world demonstrated their rejection of their oppressive governments. The civil war begins. In Syria, over the first few weeks of the protests, Assad's forces opened fire on the crowds, killing 4 people and detaining 6 more. Days later, the anti-Assad crowds burned down one of the headquarters of the Ba'ath Party, which killed 15 people. Small skirmishes continued to break out until April 25th, when the Syrian army staged full assaults on multiple towns that lasted for months. By June, over 1,000 civilians were killed and thousands more were detained in police custody. By then, the Syrian protesters began to organize and formed armed militias to combat the Syrian Arab Republic. The first of these opposition groups was the Free Syrian Army, or FSA, formed by military officers who defected from Assad's reign. The FSA's mission was to remove Assad and protect the protesters from being slaughtered. The FSA launched attacks on the Air Force intelligence complex in Damascus and on checkpoints that guarded other military bases. By 2012, Assad started using heavy artillery to target the FSA. Countless homes were destroyed from collateral damage. That same year, former Secretary General of the United Nations Kofi Annan became a special envoy representative between the Arab League and the UN to negotiate plans for a ceasefire. All the while, Assad began using attack helicopters to target the growing rebel armies. On April 12, 2012, Kofi obtained a ceasefire agreement, but it was a failure as both the Syrian government and the rebels broke the terms of the agreement. Rebels in the northeastern part of Syria declared the region a de facto autonomous or self-governing zone known as the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, or Rojava. A shared enemy. The birth of Rojava sparked the next phase of the Syrian civil war. 1 month after the ceasefire agreement, the Syrian military carried out mass executions in a rampage across towns in the Houla region of the country, killing 108 people, including 49 children and 34 women. Other rebel groups like the al-Nusra Front made headway by capturing an airbase in the Idlib Governorate region of the country. Meanwhile, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant took advantage of the chaos and began capturing territory in Syria. In 2013, the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah began supporting Assad, which led to the recapture of land along the border of Lebanon and Syria. On June 28, 2013, rebels captured the major city of Daraa, but they suffered a major loss when one of their leaders, Kamal Hamami, was assassinated by ISIL. In 2014, in the midst of all the conflict, Syria held a historic election. For the first time in the country's history, more than one candidate was allowed to run for presidential office. However, this was all a sham. State officials were forced to either vote or be arrested, and over 60% of the country was unable to vote due to military occupation. Unsurprisingly, Assad retained power. Meanwhile, ISIL's presence began to hinder both the rebels and the Ba'ath Party. In June of 2014, ISIL obtained major victories in Iraq, and the group stole heavy military weapons which they imported to their Syrian bases. In response to the growing threat, both the rebels and the Syrian government launched an offensive against ISIL. But even though both sides of the Syrian civil war had a common enemy, ISIL continued to make headway. On July 17th, the jihadist group captured the Shah oil field, and on August 19th, they executed American journalist and video reporter James Wright Foley. ISIL dealt more major blows with the destruction of a Damascus gas pipeline that helped power the city, and in May of 2015, they captured the country's phosphate mines, which was one of the last sources of income for the Ba'ath Party. Foreign powers take notice. In response to ISIL's growing occupation in Syria, the United States and its allies, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Qatar, all intervened. On September 23, 2014, US forces initiated long-range strikes with Tomahawk missiles, while fighter jets and other bombers struck targets from the sky. Despite the renewed assault, ISIL forces nearly captured the city of Kobani during a 3-month-long siege until they were finally forced to retreat on January 26. In February of 2014, roughly 56 rebel factions joined forces to create the Southern Front of the Free Syrian Army, which secured major victories at the Battle of Bosra, the Battle of Basib border crossing, and during the Daraa offensive. In October of the same year, infighting broke out between al-Nusra and the combined forces of the Hazm movement and the Syrian Revolutionaries Front. With the help of ISIL, al-Nusra secured the whole Zawiya mountain range in the Idlib province, and they also captured weapons the CIA had supplied to the SRF and the Hazm movement. In March, the Army of Conquest banded together to take back the whole of the Idlib region from the jihadist-backed al-Nusra. By this stage, Ara ash-Sham held the majority of the northern territory alongside other jihadist rebels, while the original Syrian rebels held the south. Following continued growth of ISIL and other extremist rebels, Russian forces intervened on behalf of Assad after he requested the aid of the Russian aerospace forces. Russia then launched a series of air raids on both ISIL and FSA rebel forces. This led President Obama to double down on supporting the Syrian rebels, who rejected both Assad and ISIL. In November of 2015, Paris was attacked by ISIL terrorists, and in response, France launched more airstrikes in Syria alongside the US. Tensions rose between France and Russia as Russia agreed to aid French warships, but they rejected France's anti-Assad stance. Peace agreements were torn up because Russia and Iran continued to support Assad while Western forces backed the Syrian rebels. On April the 7th, a chemical attack was launched in the city of Douma by Russian-backed Assad forces. The city was under siege for roughly 5 years by that point, and the Ba'ath Party quickly took over the city following the attack. The later stages and present day. By 2019, the Northern Syrian Buffer or Safe Zone was established, and later that same year the US withdrew from the buffer zone. Since then, Turkey and Russia have worked to ensure the Assad government has electricity and water, but millions of Syrian refugees are still displaced in camps in the midst of the turmoil. Russia pledged $500 million to rebuild Syrian infrastructure, but that was prior to the country's European invasion and the subsequent sanctions that have impacted the Russian economy. Turkey created the Astana summit to come to an agreement in Syria, and Russia and Iran both participated in the process as well. Turkey has sought to resettle millions of Syrian refugees in the area it controls, but millions more are displaced in countries all over the world. Some Syrian citizens report no aid has ever been received, despite the ongoing international efforts. China and Russia have blocked UN attempts to deliver aid through crossing points in Turkey. In 2019, the US imposed the Caesar-Syria Civilian Protection Act, which brought a new round of sanctions, and inflation has reduced the value of the Syrian pound to almost nothing. In efforts to relieve the economic strain in Syria, the Assad regime ramped up production of illegal drugs. Their largest export is phenethylene, which is a popular stimulant drug in the Middle East. In 2020 alone, Syria produced 27 tons of the drug, which is enough for 162 million doses. Producing drugs helps Assad bypass sanctions because drug transactions are made using fiat currencies like the US dollar that can be exchanged internationally. During the conflicts, 24 Syrian heritage sites were destroyed and hundreds more have been damaged. During the course of the conflict, Assad and his allies were found to have used chemical weapons of mass destruction, including mustard gas and sarin, while Russian forces also used thermobaric weapons. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimates that between 499,000 and 610,000 people have died in the conflict from 2011 to 2021. Conclusion. That's the story of how the Syrian civil war began and how it unfolded over the past decade. But the battle still rages on as the Syrian fight for freedom has evolved into an international divide that continues to threaten stability for the war-torn nation. What geopolitical topic would you like to see next? Let us know in the comments section. While you're there, remember to like and subscribe to catch the next video.